Hi, you've clicked onto the Tropical Tidbit for Sunday afternoon, September 9th. As always, the thoughts here are mine alone, and in making decisions, consult the National Hurricane Center, the National Weather Service, and your local officials for the best information for your location. We still have a ton going on in the tropics. I'll start in the Atlantic today and just briefly mention a new area that we have to watch, a tropical wave in the western Caribbean. There's a trough axis somewhere in here, moving northwestward toward the Gulf of Mexico. It's interacting with an upper level trough right in here, which is helping to enhance thunderstorm activity. And in this kind of a pattern, this means that it's something to watch because it will be drawn far enough north into the Gulf of Mexico to have time over water, and if upper level winds slacken a little bit over the next couple of days, it may find a slightly more favorable environment somewhere in here to perhaps try to develop a bit. So right now it's something just to watch. Only low chances given by the National Hurricane Center for this to develop over the next 5 days, but it may be something to keep an eye on in 3 to 4 days in the northwestern Gulf. In the rest of the Atlantic, we do have 3 storms: Florence, Isaac, and Helene. I'm going to start with Florence today. Obviously, the big story this week, a threat to the southeast U.S. coast, and this is the close-in shot showing what we were talking about yesterday with how the thunderstorm activity would gradually increase in the core of the storm after the dry air was mixed out yesterday. And that's what we have seen today, a much better looking inner core of the storm. There's even an eye trying to form here, formative eye wall with convective bursts around it. It's not closed yet, but it is beginning to intensify again. You can see a much more symmetric looking storm, and this will likely continue intensifying now for some time. There is still a little bit of mid-level shear. You'll see some of these cloud elements below the outflow moving out of the northeast. You'll see cirrus outflow expanding in the milky white semi-transparent clouds toward the north, but under that some elements are coming out of the opposite direction. This indicates a little bit of mid-level shear that might impact the core a little bit, but right now it doesn't seem to be too detrimental. What it is also doing is helping to keep Florence on a basically due westward track so far today, and that is not unexpected, but we are watching very closely to see when Florence finally starts to gain latitude and move more toward the west-northwest, and exactly how quickly that turn occurs. As the farther south Florence does track, the farther south it could make landfall eventually along the U.S. coast. So it is something that will matter, but right now there's no significant adjustments or unexpected changes to Florence's motion from what we've really anticipated over the last few days. Here's the recon mission that just left a little bit ago. It found pressures in the mid-980s and then a drop sonde actually near 980 at the end of the mission, showing that pressure was falling, an indication of strengthening, and the wind field has reattained maximum values of hurricane force. So this is now Hurricane Florence once more with winds of about 75 or 80 miles per hour, and this is likely to continue going up as conditions do favor intensification of Florence over the next few days. If we look at the water vapor loop here, we talked about how Florence is already getting much better organized internally, and there's nothing to really hinder it environmentally. There's not much wind shear or dry air ahead of the storm. We did talk about a little bit of northeasterly mid-level flow, still technically imparting some shear, but that will decrease over the next couple of days, and it doesn't seem to be detrimentally impacting the storm anyway at this moment. We can see cirrus clouds expanding to the west and the north of the system, radially outward, indicating the development of a nice symmetric outflow layer that is an indication of low shear aloft and will continue to expand as the storm comes west. And there's really nothing to mess that up because the big strong jet to the north is well removed from Florence, and this westerly flow on the north side of a Caribbean ridge is down to the southwest. In between these two features is a large area of relatively quiescent flow. By that I mean very light, weak features. We do have a little bit of an upper low here sitting southwest of Bermuda, but these are all very weak, and Florence, as this outflow layer continues to expand, will just push into this and really nudge most of these little features out of the way. There's really not that much shear here, and Florence's outflow layer will likely be able to have its way with everything in this area southwest of Bermuda. So Florence is unlikely to encounter very much wind shear until it starts to approach the southeastern U.S. coast, at which point wind shear might pick up. But at that point it might be frankly too late, just because the storm will already be powerful and it can only weaken so quickly as it approaches the coast, and it remains to be seen whether it will weaken at all. One thing that also favors Florence on approach to the continent is the relative lack of dry air masses compared to most East Coast hurricanes. Usually you have a big trough coming in and helping to steer the storm northward. These troughs are normally associated with continental dry air masses that set up over the Appalachians and try to get entrained into the hurricane as it nears the coast. In this case, we don't really have that. The nearest continentally dry air mass is over the Great Plains, and although there is some dry air you can see in light brown around the storm, this is pretty normal. There is no overwhelming dry air mass waiting to get entrained into the storm, and for that reason, it may be better able to maintain itself on the way toward the coast, assuming that wind shear does not become very strong. So the bottom line here is that Florence is expected to be very powerful all the way until landfall somewhere in the southeast U.S. here, and should be treated as a serious event that could bring life-threatening wind and storm surge in addition to rainfall when it comes ashore. And speaking of the track, this is the European showing day 3, Wednesday morning. This is where it shows the storm, and we'll show again the fact that it's this big ridge to the northeast of the storm that's really directing it northwestward and forcing it into the eastern U.S. And this seems to still be the most likely scenario now. There is technically still a chance that if Florence is far enough north at this point that it's able to move around the ridge a little bit farther east and actually stay offshore of the United States, but it seems less likely at this point than a track that takes it into the southeast U.S. coast somewhere. How are we doing today in terms of certainty about where? Well, more and more model guidance is zeroing in on the fact that this is most likely to be a Carolinas landfall somewhere. Can't really narrow it down specifically, and it doesn't mean that these are the only places where landfall could occur. Technically, if the storm is a little farther south, it could move as far south as, say, Georgia. We're starting to get North Florida kind of out of the picture here in terms of what seems possible, but it could still get as far south as, say, Georgia. So don't assume that that door is closed. It's not yet. And so really anywhere around the southeast U.S. coast could still see direct impacts, but right now it seems to be that the Carolinas are where a landfall is most likely to occur at this moment, but there are still several days left during which adjustments could occur. If we go out to day 4 now, Thursday morning, this is where the European has it on this particular run. It moves into North Carolina here on this particular model, and you can see this very strong ridge is again forcing it to the northwest. But now we run into an additional problem. And we talked about it yesterday, the fact that as the hurricane moves ashore, this ridge will be weakening, and as a result, steering currents are going to collapse around Florence. So by the time we go out a day here after landfall on Friday morning, we can see the hurricane has not moved inland very quickly. This ridge is weakening now, and there's no big trough to the west of the storm to help accelerate it northeast and out. So unfortunately, the hurricane is now becoming mired in an area of weak steering, and this means the hurricane is likely to slow down drastically near or just after the time of landfall. By Saturday morning, it's barely moved. On this particular model run, it's still over North Carolina. The exact details here don't matter as much as the recognition that the hurricane is likely to cause a lot of inland flooding as it moves very slowly post landfall. And so this is something to keep in mind. This will not just be a coastal event. As bad as the wind and surge could be at the point of direct landfall, we could have power outages and inland flooding, major concerns well inland, potentially up into the mid-Atlantic, depending on exactly what the track is. There could be a wide swath of very heavy rains somewhere in this area, and many states could see impacts that are severe. So do be prepared for that in case the storm moves up into your area. Here's the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center showing essentially what it's shown for the last couple of days, a west-northwestward and then northwestward track toward the southeast U.S. coast. It has shifted north maybe a tad since yesterday, but the details here don't matter too much just yet because this is still about 4 days away from landfall sometime on Thursday currently expected, and little adjustments will occur and can occur with any hurricane nearing the U.S. And don't assume that we know everything just yet 4 days out, but right now it does seem like the Carolinas are most likely to get the landfall. Keep in mind that a track on the southern side of this cone or perhaps even into Georgia is still possible, and the door is not yet closed on that possibility. We'll have to wait and see. Right now the most likely landfall location is somewhere here in the Carolinas, and this could occur sometime on Thursday, but the forward speed can also have uncertainty with it, so don't rely too much on the timing, and don't rely on the timing of the eye's arrival for when to finish preparations. Remember, plenty of wind and rain and dangerous weather extend out ahead of the eye prior to arrival. So what you want to look at is this graphic showing the earliest possible arrival time of tropical storm force winds. In this case, it tells you that as soon as Wednesday evening, you could start seeing detrimental impacts to the coast. It's most likely to be a little later than that, but because we don't know exactly how fast the storm will move between now and then, you want to be safe, and the earliest possible arrival time is probably Wednesday evening as a safe bet, before which you should be ready, because after that point you won't be able to prepare anymore. So look at this graphic for guidance on that, for having your hurricane plan ready to go and having preparations just in case the storm moves into your particular area. Still time to watch this, still uncertain exactly which portions of the coastline could receive the worst impacts. We won't really know for a couple of days yet, and adjustments could and will likely occur as time goes on and we get better data. Don't assume that we know everything just yet, but be ready just in case. Alright, so we have a couple more storms to talk about here in the Atlantic. Helene is no longer a threat to land as it moves past the Cabo Verde Islands here and is expected to recurve harmlessly into the central Atlantic, so we won't talk much about that. But we do have Isaac in the central Atlantic, and as we take a closer look at this storm, we can see that as the sun sets here, we have a tiny storm, but one that is becoming a little bit better organized. We have what looks like an inner core and a potential eye wall forming here right at the end of the loop before the sunset takes it out. You'll see a little of a ring structure of deep thunderstorms showing the formation of an eye and the indications that this is continuing to intensify on its way westward as wind shear begins to lessen a little bit. You can still see, similar to what we saw with Florence, some cloud elements underneath of the outflow coming out of the northeast, indicating some mid-level shear remains, and because the storm is small, it could potentially suffer a little bit due to that mid-level shear over the next couple of days. But it remains to be seen. Sometimes these vortices can be resilient when they're small and intense. Sometimes they can be fragile. As we've talked about before, small storms are a little unpredictable in terms of intensity, so there is some uncertainty here about how strong Isaac will get over the next few days. But in general, the environment could favor intensification as long as the wind shear doesn't prove too much for the storm, and this is expected to become a hurricane on its way westward here. I'm actually going to refresh this. I think the 5 p.m. advisory is out. It is. This is the new forecast showing that this is expected to become a hurricane soon and move basically due westward toward the Lesser Antilles. And at this point here, you can go back and look at yesterday's video if you want to see it. Wind shear could increase again, and it could weaken on approach to the islands, but it could be fairly strong by this point as well. There is a little bit of uncertainty there, as I said, so be prepared for a strong storm here just in case. In addition, a stronger storm might try to sneak a little bit farther north here than shown, depending on exactly how strong it is. So there is some uncertainty also in the track because it also depends on the storm's intensity. So anywhere here in the Lesser Antilles could potentially receive impacts, and these are likely to begin sometime late on Wednesday on the current forecast. So we'll be watching this at the same time as we're watching Florence, and it remains to be seen what impacts might occur in Puerto Rico. It's a little hard to say yet. We need to wait until the storm gets closer. Finally, there's another impact possibly to the United States in the Pacific in the form of Hurricane Olivia, which has interestingly become better looking over the last few hours. Here you can see an eye kind of showing up here and indicating that this remains a hurricane. A recon aircraft did go in earlier and found that this was still fairly strong with winds above hurricane force in some parts of the circulation, and this is continuing to move westward and expected to near Hawaii at some point in about 3 days. With this track more toward the west-southwest, it will eventually weaken more as it will encounter wind shear as it nears the Hawaiian Islands, and it is not expected to be a hurricane any longer when it arrives in the island group, but it could still have pretty strong winds, 60-70 miles per hour, something like that. Could still occur, and the high terrain in the islands can cause stronger winds than you might expect, as well as heavy rains regardless of how strong the winds are and regardless of exactly where the center of the system tracks. So this could bring detrimental and life-threatening flooding and wind hazards regardless. So keep an eye on this and be prepared, as this could be occurring as soon as late Tuesday night, and we'll keep an eye on that as well. All of these storms happening at once. Again, lots going on in the tropics. Do bear with me over the next few days as we discuss it all, and do be prepared in the Lesser Antilles, in the southeastern US, and in Hawaii. Everyone just listen to the official sources. They do a great job. Believe me, you will get good information from them. Just be prepared and have a plan in case these storms come to your particular location. That is it for today. Thanks for watching.